Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Graves with the Legal AF channel here on the Midas Touch Network. I am joined today by Ann Nelson, one of my favorite authors. She wrote the book, The Shadow Network. This nonfiction book is a must read. If you haven't read it yet, please get a copy. If you if you've read it already once, please read it again because the insights continue to inform what's happening in our country. She also has done a series of articles to update and bring the book into what's happening in the 2024, 2025 through the Washington Spectator. That online publication you can get by Googling Washington Spectator and Ann Nelson. And Ann has also been busy this past year, more than a year, I suppose now, with supporting the work of a film that is based in part on her extraordinary research. This is not the only area of expertise that Ann Nelson has, given her extraordinary career in journalism. But this is the topic we're going to talk about today, which is, what is this shadow network that has really been distorting public policy? Why does it matter that people know what's happening, and what can people do about it? So welcome to the show, Ann Nelson.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I'm a big fan of all of your work.
Thank you so much. Well, so let's just jump right in, and maybe we could start with the present moment in the sense of you wrote the book, The Shadow Network, but tell us what's happening right now. And not everything's happening right now. There's something happening every hour on the hour, but sort of what you're seeing in this new Trump regime and how that relates to the work that you've been uncovering through the Shadow Network and your related research.
Well, Lisa, this is the thing that drives me crazy, because what I did in my book was show that there is this machinery that has pulled together and created a whole host of organizations that serve different purposes. And they're very agile, so they're very responsive to the moment, and they're all about subverting democracy in various ways. And the coordination is the important part. So what I wrote about is something called the Council for National Policy, which is an umbrella group that brings these organizations together. Now, just 2 days ago, or maybe it was even yesterday, the New York Times ran an article about something called campus reform, right? And they hired somebody who is their hitman for attacking colleges and universities for alleged anti-Semitic policies, where really, speaking as somebody who's been inside academia, the first people to suffer from these policies are Jewish faculty and students, because they're the ones that are having their funding cut off. They're the ones that are having their classes canceled. So it's really quite hypocritical. Now, the article in the Times says, oh, this is a project of something called the Leadership Institute, but we're not going to tell you what that is. Well, what that is a core organization in the Council for National Policy that works with Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA, which amplifies what the Leadership Institute does and what campus reform does. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. They're part of the same funding network. They're directed to be very opportunistic, according to what's going on in the news cycle. And although the New York Times and the Washington Post have run articles that refer to the Council for National Policy and the machinery, it's not part of their analysis. Right. And let you understand that it's coordinated funding, coordinated legal activity through groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, coordinated strategy through the Leadership Institute, coordinated exploitation of Christian congregations. Then you don't see the whole. And you say, oh, isn't it interesting that there's this little organization doing this stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it was disappointing to see that extensive article that was talking about this particular component, this one sort of arm or, finger, in essence, of this big wheel of a network. And a lot of people don't know what the Leadership Institute is. And, when I was looking into that group, one of the things that struck me immediately was how long it has been around and the role it has played in training these right-wing operatives, including people like James O'Keefe, who launched the Project Veritas operation to basically smear progressives and progressive institutions with these slice and dice videos that take things out of context. He, by the way, has targeted me a few times unsuccessfully, but he now has a new organization that is in his own name after there were serious allegations raised of misspending the funds of his donors. But let's not dwell on James O'Keefe and his sort of hatchet job operations. Let's talk a little bit about what the LI, which I think of as lie, but okay, the Leadership Institute, the role that the Leadership Institute plays in the right wing infrastructure, along with CNP and how this funding mechanism works.
Right. So from the beginning, which dates from the founding in 1981 and the Reagan administration, you had mega donors such as the DeVos family of Michigan and the Amway multi-level. Some people call it Ponzi scheme. I couldn't possibly do that.
Right. MLM, multi-level
But let's call
marketing.
it multi-level marketing, and they're $6 billion and growing, and they put huge amounts of money. The Wyoming financier, Foster Friess, is another, and then lots and lots of fossil fuel money, including from the Koch organizations, because they don't want environmental regulations, they don't want corporate taxes, they don't want taxes on billionaires. But they couldn't sell this to the electorate because they're fundamentally unpopular policies. So what they did was found an organization that identified untapped pools of voters who tended to be the ones they went after were evangelical voters who were low propensity and low information voters, and identified districts where if they won them, they could tilt the Electoral College, they could tilt the House of Representatives and the Senate, and that indeed is what's happened. So the Leadership Institute was founded in the 1970s by a man from Louisiana named Morton Blackwell, a Goldwater activist. And he decided that they needed machinery to recruit and develop and fund both candidates and election workers. And they play the long game. And as I point out in my book, Shadow Network, he says, don't worry about what is actually true. The important thing is winning. It's all about winning. So there was a strategy that was implemented decades ago that is quite, it doesn't really follow the norm of American culture in the past. But what it does is take people like, let's say, Mike Johnson, and pluck them out of obscurity, fund them, and shape their course of their career up through the ranks. So he goes from a minor Louisiana politician to be Speaker of the House without any of the qualifications you'd expect for that role, right? And he credits the Leadership Institute and Tony Perkins and this entire operation with his political career. And indeed, you can't really explain Mike Johnson's career without it.
Yeah. And I want to interject there because it is astonishing how long the Leadership Institute has been in operation, how many basically generations of right-wing leaders it has trained, or people for right-wing leadership posts, I suppose I should say. And I think the other part of that, another part of that dissonance, which your comments sort of trigger in me, is on the one hand, you have this group along with its allies that are targeting evangelical voters, people who would describe themselves as devout Christians. And one of the key commandments of the 10 Commandments is "Thou shalt not lie." The notion that in this faith, truth is supposed to be something that is honored, not transgressed. "Thou shalt not bear false witness," in essence, is the terminology. And yet the group is devoted to winning at any cost, which seems, at odds with that commandment. That's just my observation.
Lisa, there is hardly a commandment that they don't violate. I have to say that in writing my book, I was absolutely shocked by the amount of sexual stalking and misdeeds and indeed crimes that were committed. And I just have to think that these very restrictive religious environments bred a level of repression that has been shocking. And I mean, it's still playing out. You're still having people who are past and present members of the CNP
Yeah.
who are disclosed as sexual predators or
Just
connected to
this
sexual
year,
predators.
even this year, like last month, I think. Right. Right.
Exactly. And at a certain point, after it, I kept watching it add up, and I said, "Okay, this is a feature, not a bug." So,
Yeah.
yeah, the greed, the graft, the sexual misconduct, the lack of truthiness, the ethic violations on all fronts. This is just a naked power grab that is cloaked in religious garb. And
Yeah.
I say that it's
Oh,
also super smart. We cannot put that aside. So the Leadership Institute, even when I was researching like 4 years ago, they claimed that they had trained over 250,000 political activists, candidates, campaign managers. That's a lot. And then they network them and then they place them in jobs on Capitol Hill and in right wing talk radio. They network them so they're coordinated. So it's a massive operation. And the other thing that's so important for us to remember is that they work in advance. So before previous midterms, I just went online and looked at their training sessions that were taking place 18 months before the elections, before the midterm elections. And I used Texas as the sample. And they had training in place, in county, in something like over 40 counties in Texas
wow.
18 months before the elections. Now, the Democrats have not been doing that, and they have paid a price.
Yeah. Yeah. It's extraordinary. I really appreciate your mapping that out and also how your book tells these stories so compellingly. It's certainly not the case that as an official policy, these organizations, are embracing sexual predation, but it is the case that over these many years, numerous people involved in these orgs have been charged and convicted of serious sexual offenses. It is really disturbing. And the other disturbing feature to me is that what we've seen in the last, 10 years, in essence, is this rise of what some of the individuals who've been part of this operation call Christian nationalism. I sort of, I don't like that terminology myself. I want to call them crynats because I don't want to criticize Christians who are, who are faithful believers who are not party to this power grab, or the idea of nationalism in a more general sense of, supporting the nation versus nationalist in the sense of fascism. But the crynats have been raising more money, rising in power. And some of their key operators, some of their key operatives and leaders are now in significant roles of power within the Trump administration. And if they're not in the administration, some of them also have influence, direct access to Trump to advance an agenda that some of them have openly admitted, like Russell Vought and others, that they've openly admitted is a Christian nationalist agenda. What does that mean to you? What are your thoughts about that, Anne? Because I know you spent a lot more time thinking about it, and also with the film. If you could talk about the film, the documentary, I trust your instincts and your judgment on this deeply.
Yeah, well, one of the things that was so interesting about speaking at screenings of the film last year, and I spoke in 18 states at over 30 screenings, and I really wanted to concentrate on the middle of the country because that's where I'm from. I grew up in Nebraska and Oklahoma. And I have to say that Christian communities have been the first victims of this movement. So a lot of the screenings were sponsored by interfaith organizations in these cities who were saying, "What are they doing to our faith?" We go to Sunday school and we learn that you're supposed to help the poor and support the widows and be kind to the stranger, and these policies are doing the opposite. So how can they do this in our name? So there's real consternation. And when people watch Bad Faith, a lot of times they said, okay, we knew some of the details, but it connected the dots for us. But I also think that, certainly in the environment I grew up in, the the churches did not feel that it was their job to be political, right? You go to church, you talk about Jesus, and that's what these organizations have changed. they have strong-armed pastors across the country to preach MAGA and even QAnon from the pulpit. Uh, and I have talked personally to pastors who have resisted and said, "Look, I just don't want to use my church for politics," and they get attacked. They get hate messages on their phone machines, and in some cases, they get fired for not being MAGA enough. Um, and in the course of really militarizing these churches, um, there's one article that I wish people would look at in the Washington Spectator about a Pentecostal political rally that I covered in Michigan. And one of the websites that they promoted, which is also connected to this whole network of Turning Point USA and other CNP organizations, is a website where you grade your pastor on how MAGA his sermons are.
Wow.
He doesn't make the grade, they say find a new pastor or find a new church, right? So they're organizing purges, not just of the school boards, not just of the party precincts, but also of the local churches where people, they're commanding pastors to tell their congregants to vote for Republicans and to canvass for Republicans and to enroll as election workers during the campaigns, which might be the most dangerous element of all.
Right. And now we have the Trump administration through court filings saying that pastors can directly endorse political candidates, like to go against the longstanding IRS rule for nonprofits, whether it's a church or other nonprofit entity, to not being able to use an entity that receives not just not taxable donations, but donations where the people who give the money get a tax break for doing so. And now we've seen Trump attack the Johnson Amendment. That's what that goes back to in the 1950s, this really important line. And now in 2025, we have this administration signaling in court that it wants these churches to be able to directly endorse candidates, really, which means him. And, in my opinion, that's part of what's happening. And the other part that I've heard, now this is anecdotal, I haven't heard this myself, but that I've seen reported in some places, is that in some of these congregations, some of the MAGA Trump fans will assail the pastor for, teaching baseline Bible teachings about love thy neighbor as being too woke. That's just mind-blowing to me. Can you talk a little bit about that and also what the Trump administration is up to based on your observations?
Well, yeah, and the assailing of the pastors is not just for, being woke. Even being neutral is not allowed. And in my book, I start with the Southern Baptist Convention, which has, this movement is rooted in what was happening in Texas, and it brought in the televangelists and other pastors who were making money off of segregation academies during integration of schools. So you go back to the 80s, and that was what was going on. My theory is that now that they've achieved over 80% of Republican votes with the fundamentalists, right, Southern Baptists and their sort, they have really, really reached into the Pentecostals. And the Pentecostals are the fastest growing religious organization in the United States and in the world, right? But they're kind of below the radar because they're not organized in the same way that other churches are. They don't have bishops. They don't have a hierarchy. They have a lot more religious entrepreneurs, which is what this rally in Michigan was that I saw. And the Johnson Amendment was a good idea, but I have been to many, many of these religious services, and it has been absolutely flouted over time. So I don't think that, I think that it formalizes what's happening anyway. And in fact, I've been in religious settings, where they openly say things like it's a sin to vote for a Democrat, right? It's a sin. And then they characterized Kamala Harris as Jezebel. They love the book of Revelations and all the serpents and all the demons that are going to come and eat your lunch. And I mean, it's really a form of magical thinking that I guess is very powerful for people's imaginations. And the other thing about these services is that, when like the Michigan meeting I went to had a heavy metal religious rock band that kind of drove people into this incantation state of mind. And then Turning Point USA had a representative who got up and said that the goal was to recruit 500 churches in Michigan alone, and that Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA would provide free educational materials for weekly meetings along with free pizza up to 400 people a week. Now, this was political doctrination going on in up to, to 500 churches in Michigan. And these tent meetings that I covered were replicated in, guess what? All 7 swing states. And in the meeting I was in Michigan, it had, they estimated 3,000 people in the tent over 3 days. And by the Michigan, the Michigan elections have been won by numbers like 9,000 total.
Wow.
So if
Wow.
each person in the tent goes and recruits 2 friends, there you have it.
Wow. It is extraordinary. You know, I have someone who's read the book of Revelation a number of times because my one of my grandfathers converted over to evangelical Christianity for a period later in his life, and was sort of obsessed with the Hal Lindsey Late Great Planet Earth stuff. And so I spent a lot of time reading that material, which is sort of impenetrable. But also, we've seen in some ways this distortion almost basically on a foreign policy level. The idea of moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the notion that some of these legislators or policymakers think that they're preparing for end times. Obviously over thousands of years, many people have said that they're preparing for end times. This is a sort of common refrain, even in other religions, the sort of epochal, notion that certain times are ending. But I don't think that public policy in America should be set based on one person's idiosyncratic individual religious views versus based on science and facts and the needs of people versus the notion like, we can just despoil the planet because it's just going to be converted in end times soon anyway. I mean, it really and in some ways to me, as someone who, has studied faith a lot over the years, it's extraordinarily arrogant for people to think that they should be imposing their religious beliefs on others through law, through American law. But that's part of what we're seeing. And I've also been a little unnerved at these events that Trump has held with these preachers sort of preying on him, as if he is not just the president of the United States, but some sort of religious figure in these times. And it's been perplexing for me to see that embrace given the actual record that Trump has of lying, of cheating on his wives, of bilking people, out of their payments, like on and on and on again. So I it's hard for me to believe, but I have heard people that I know say, as a Christian, they believe everyone can be forgiven. And so they've forgiven Trump for his past transgressions, and they believe he's part of some sort of second coming. What are your thoughts on that, Anne?
My thoughts are that, as going back to Morton Blackwell's philosophy, do not take them at their word, right? They're instrumentalizing everything, including these poor people who go to church and being told it's a sin to vote for a Democrat, right? I mean, they're using them. And I am an old school reporter, follow the money. There's tons of money pouring into these operations. And one of the things that I looked for in my reporting is when the money is driving these operations, what are the belief systems of the people who are paying for them? The Koch brothers. Where do the Koch brothers go to church? I found no evidence whatsoever that they did. I found no evidence of any religious, spiritual element to their thinking other than, as I used to say, worshiping Mammon, the god of greed.
Right. That's discussed in the Bible. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're paying for a lot of these operations. In my book, I follow how the cross-funding works and how they pay, these organizations that promote this religious window dressing. And what's so tragic for me is that what they're paying for ultimately hurts people. It's resulting in children growing up in states without access to public health. Their public schools are starved of funding. Their environmental, their environment is corrupted by pollution, and people are being hurt by this, and yet they're being propagandized into voting for it, and that's what we have to counteract.
Yeah. Well, this is a great point to pivot to the last question for this interview. Before I say to you, or actually, I'm just going to say to you, Anne, we have to have you back on because we've got to talk about what's happening in higher education, diversity, and more. But let's conclude this segment together of, I hope, a series of conversations with some of your thoughts on what people can do about what's happening. And I will take that up again in another conversation, but let's end on that positive note. Like, what can people do about it in your view? Or what should people be doing about it?
So one thing that's been going on, okay, I want everybody to think of a number, and that number is 7,309. That is the number of votes that determined the outcome of the House of Representatives in the last election and made everything that we're seeing now possible. And those 7,309 votes, and we're talking about the equivalent of a very small town, right? 7,309. We're in 3 districts in Iowa, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. So if 8,000 or even 7,500 people had voted differently, we would be in a lot less of a mess. So one thing that has to happen is people have to focus on their parties and their precincts and their election workers now, not next year, not October, now, because the MAGA movement has been infiltrating and stalking and putting their people, their activists, their militants into these positions for years. But there's still time for legitimate citizens to go in and be guarantors of the machinery of democracy that we'll need for legitimate elections next year. We need to find candidates and not just, and I'm not partisan in this. If you have an honest Republican who won't get primaried out by the MAGA candidate, support them. If you have an independent like Dan Osborne in Nebraska, excellent. Just find honest people who want to support democracy, and then learn from the Leadership Institute and start recruiting candidates and campaign workers and talking to people and listening to people in these districts now, so that you have things in place, because I think there is potential for a repudiation of these criminal policies in the midterms next November. There's a lot of, negative polling about what's going on. A lot of people are getting hurt in every possible, everything from, corporations and tariffs to farmers and soybeans. But that has to be articulated and explained. And you have to have a sense of common feeling with these Trump voters and say, look, we understand that you've had problems for a while. We understand you're having problems now. We're in this together.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's hope, but only if people get busy.
No, that's right. And thank you so much for concluding on that, because I think one of the powers in rising authoritarianism is to try to sort of stamp out hope and make people think that things are inevitable or they can't be changed or we're just stuck. But in fact, things are not cemented. There's a lot of space in the months and years ahead, but there's also an urgency to have real organizing so people can defend their rights, defend their interests, help us thrive, and also, in my view, reject people who would manipulate the levers of the election in order to cheat. We really need to make sure people who are not election denialists, who are in those offices, people who are going to make sure that everyone can vote no matter what their party is, so that we can have a fair election in 2026 and beyond. So, Anne Nelson, you are a true gem. I'm so glad that you came on today. I hope you'll come back soon, because there's so much more for us to talk about. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with our audience. And everyone, please please subscribe. This is Lisa Graves from True North Research and Corn Accountability Action here on the Midas Touch Network on the Legal AF channel. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks, Anne.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.